Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us on what is almost the finale of Being a Man Festival. We are talking about 007. We will try to find a way of exiting the stage in 007 style at the end. Booster seats, maybe. And I was actually also tempted to make a pregnancy joke, because here I am. But of course, there are very few roles for pregnant women in James Bond books or movies, and in fact, as far as I could tell, and I'm sure somebody will correct me if I'm wrong, despite his womanizing, prolific womanizer that he was, Bond sired one child, I think, in all of that. But we're going to be trying to decide what it is that has made him such a compelling, enduring cultural force for over 60 years. We're going to begin with some letters that will enable us to hear from Ian Fleming himself, courtesy of Hugh Quarshie. And then I will introduce the rest of the panel, we'll talk a bit, and then we'll throw it open to you, the audience. So please make sure you have plenty of questions left at the end. Hugh, I think you're going to be reading a selection of letters from a new collection edited by Fergus Fleming, the nephew of Ian Fleming, and over to you.
Letter 001. Dear Mrs. James Bond, Fleming had never made any secret of the fact that he had borrowed his hero's name from one of his favorite books, Birds of the West Indies by James Bond. But now, almost 10 years after he wrote Casino Royale, news had reached the Bonds that you had brazenly picked up the name of a real human being for your rascal. 20th of June, 1961. Dear Mrs. James Bond, I don't know where to begin to ask your forgiveness for my very tardy acknowledgement to your letter of February the 1st. I received it in Jamaica, and since I was almost on the way to Nassau, I decided to telephone the Chaplins on arrival and get in touch with you and your husband. Unfortunately, I could get no reply from their telephone number, and I again put your letter aside. Then, when I got back to England in March, I proceeded to have a swift heart attack, which laid me out until now. And it is only today that your letter is again before me, and blackest of consciences is sitting on my shoulder. I will confess at once that your husband has every reason to sue me in every possible position and for practically every kind of libel in the book. For I will now confess the damnable truth. I have a small house which I built in Oracabessa in Jamaica just after the war, and some 10 years ago, a confirmed bachelor on the eve of marriage, I decided to take my mind off the dreadful prospect by writing a thriller. I was determined that my secret agent should be as anonymous a personality as possible. Even his name should be the very reverse of the kind of Peregrine Carruthers whom one meets in this type of fiction. At the time, one of my Bibles was, and still is, Birds of the West Indies by James Bond. And it struck me that this name, brief, unromantic, and yet very masculine, was just what I needed. And so James Bond II was born and started off on the career that, I must confess, has been meteoric, culminating with his choice by your president as his favorite thriller hero. See Life, March 17th. So there is my dreadful confession, together with limitless apologies and thanks for the fun and fame I have had from the most extraordinary choice of so many years ago. In return, I can only offer your James Bond unlimited use of the name Ian Fleming for any purposes he may think fit. Perhaps one day he will discover some particularly horrible species of bird which he would like to christen in an insulting fashion. That might be a way of getting his own back. Anyway, I send you both my most affectionate regards and good wishes. And should you ever return to Jamaica, I would be very happy indeed to lend you my house for a week or so that you may inspect in comfort the shrine where the second James Bond was born. Letter 002. In 1961, in a Life magazine article, President John F. Kennedy had mentioned From Russia with Love as one of his top 10 books. The endorsement gave Bond a crucial fillip in the United States and was a favor that Fleming never forgot. Dear Mr. Kennedy, thank you very much for your charming note of June the 1st, and I am delighted to take this opportunity to thank Kennedys everywhere for the electric effect their commendation has had on my sales in America. My last book, The Spy Who Loved Me, has had an extremely mixed reception, due largely to the late appearance of James Bond. But I can now tell you that my next and longest to date has James Bond in from the first page to the last, and all Kennedys will be receiving a copy around next Easter. Incidentally, you may be amused to pass around the enclosed translation from Izvestia of May 29th last. I am most amused to learn that I have been selected by the Russians as part of America's strong right hand. Over here, we are all watching with fascination your gallant attempts to harass American gangsterdom. If James Bond can be any help to you, please let me know, and I will have a word with them. Again, with my warmest thanks for your kindness in writing. Letter 003. Mrs. Fruin of Toronto, a sharp-witted and observant fan, took Fleming to task over several inconsistencies in his novels. Among other things, she wanted to know, A, why the light above M's door seemed to be green in one book, red in another. B, Bond gained his 00 qualification for killing a man in cold blood, yet later said he had never done such a thing. C, the method for contacting head office seemed to vary. D, Bond took his coffee now black, now white. E, M's office was variously on the 9th floor and the 8th. And F, some of Fleming's dates were contradictory. Additionally, she bemoaned the incapacitation of Felix Leiter in Live and Let Die, begged Fleming to resurrect Mathis, and told him not to write any more short stories. Quote, "They don't do him justice, and your female fans may not have husbands who read Playboy." So maybe the money is quicker, but since when has Bond cared about money? Unquote. To assist him in future endeavors, she supplied a plot featuring Bond, his old secretary Miss Ponsonby, and Mathis. I look forward with great anticipation to the next installment. This is the letter. Dear Mrs. Fruin, thank you for your really wonderful letter. In searching for even the meagrest riposte, may I point out that installment, the last line of your letter, is spelt with only one L. Now let me say at once that all your points are extremely well made, though you slipped up badly in not noticing that Vent Vert is made by Balmain and not by Dior, and that the brakes on the Orient Express are not hydraulic, but vacuum. Here are the answers to your specific points. Miss Moneypenny, for obvious reasons, objected to having a red light in her room and insisted on the more appropriate pastel shade bulbs, until the day the Office of Works repainted her room in green. The day after the painting was completed, and not noticing the green light against the green paint, she went into M's room with some signals to find him fast asleep at his desk. She tiptoed out, but at once rang up the works department and had a red light fitted, which is still there. B, forgetfulness. C, for security reasons, the regulations for contacting headquarters are changed from time to time. D, Bond only takes cream with his coffee at breakfast time. E, the floors were renumbered when 2 floors were concertinaed into one to accommodate very large and bulky equipment for a new communication center. The top floor is now the 8th. F, yours truly also puzzled, and I must talk to Bond about this. You will realize, of course, that in writing James Bond's biography, I am entirely dependent on what he tells me. And if he is occasionally equivocal, particularly in the matter of dates, I assume that he has some sound security reason for confusing me. So far as your general comments are concerned, I should mention that Felix Leiter is by no means incapacitated, as you will have seen from Diamonds Are Forever. He reappears in excellent health in the next volume of the biography entitled Thunderball, which will be published here next April. Mathis is in good health and spirits, and Bond tells me he is almost certain to run into him again in the near future. Thank you also very much for the suggested plot. Bentley with an E, please, not Bently. But I'm not sure that Bond is as keen as all that on Miss Ponsonby. She has recently shown signs of withering through overlong protection of her virginity. And even Bond has complained to me that she is becoming neurotic. Finally, in exchange for a letter which has given me a vast amount of pleasure and entertainment, I am sending you a copy of my last book, which, it appears from your letter, you have not yet read. I'm sorry it consists of short stories, but I can only write what Bond tells me. These were fragmentary adventures between his longer assignments. Again, with my warmest thanks for your deep analysis of my opuscula. Letter 004 to A.G. Allen, Esquire, 1 Upper Stone Street, Maidstone. Kent Arthur Allen was a man of military stamp who complained that many of Fleming's so-called facts were, quote, a lot of rot. First of all, it was impossible for two horses in the same race to be given odds of 6-4 on. Secondly, I should imagine it is quite a difficult feat to pick up a girl and lay her on the floor if you have an arm around her thighs. And why on the floor? Thirdly, I have never yet seen a mobile Bofors where a corporal or any other rank could turn the elevating and traversing cranks at the same time. And to the best of my knowledge, there is only one firing pedal. Unbristling his moustache to a slight degree, he admitted that his work as a pen pusher didn't pay much, so he couldn't afford Fleming's books or anyone else's. But I shall keep a watchful eye on the Fs in our local public library in the hope that they will purchase more of your books. At the moment, they only have Moonraker and the one that I have been criticizing. Fleming wrote, "Many thanks for your most interesting and expert letter of February the 16th, which I have just come back to find waiting for me. The trouble about writing these books is that one cannot possibly satisfy all the various experts on their particular subjects, and all I can do, when in doubt, is to submit the passages concerned to somebody who should know. In the case of the racing sequence in Diamonds Are Forever, the person in question was William Woodward Jr., the owner of Nashua, who was subsequently shot by his wife in very grisly circumstances. And you may notice that the book is dedicated in part to him. However, I do not question your excellent reasoning, and I only wish you had been within reach when I was writing the book. As to your point about the girl, all I can suggest is that you should try making love to a girl on the Dunlopilla mattresses of the Queen Elizabeth. You would then know why I chose the floor. On the other hand, I must plead guilty to the Bofors passage, but although this was read for me by a gunnery expert from Hythe, I admit he was rather an elderly one, and I dare say your points are legitimate. I greatly enjoy these tough comments from my readers, and hope you will stir up your librarian so that in due course I may receive some more sharp criticisms to help keep me up to the mark. Letter 005 to the editor of the Manchester Guardian. Fleming had suffered a rebuke at the hands of Bernard Bergonzi in 20th century for a diet of, quote, unrestricted sadism and satyriasis. This was followed by an article in The Guardian condemning him for, quote, the cult of luxury for its own sake. It was a sinister development, the paper intoned, and a sign of moral decay. In the leader column it said, "This is an advertising agency world where the man of distinction sits secure in the knowledge that his is the very best butter. And since the reader is plainly expected to identify himself with Bond, these works are symptomatic of a decline in taste." In a soul-searching trump of despair, if one of the most bourgeois and peaceable people in the world decide that a diet of sex and violence is to its liking, is it not because it can thereby sublimate its more antisocial instincts? Fleming replied, "Sir, I am most grateful for the scholarly examination of my James Bond stories in your leader columns on Monday, but since this follows close upon a 9-page inquest in the 20th century, I hope you will forgive a squeak from the butterfly before any more big wheels roll down upon it. It is true that sex plays an important part in James Bond's life, and that his profession requires him to be more or less constantly involved in violent action. It is also true that, as in any real spy life, when the villain gets hold of Bond, Bond is made to suffer painfully. What other punishment for failure would be appropriate? That Bond should receive an extra heavy demand note from the Inland Revenue? Or that he should be reduced in his civil service rank from principal officer to acting principal? But, as you, sir, put it, what is more sinister is the cult of luxury for its own sake, and the kind of luxury held up for the reader's emulation. The idea that anyone should smoke a brand of cigarette not because they enjoy them, but because they are exclusive, that is, because they cost more, is pernicious, and it is implicit in all Mr. Fleming's glib descriptions of food, drink, and clothes. I accept the rebuke, but more on the score of vulgarity than on the counts you recite. I have this to say in my extenuation. One of the reasons why I chose the pseudonym of James Bond for my hero, rather than, say, Peregrine Maltravers, was that I wished him to be unobtrusive. Exotic things would happen to and around him, but he would be a neutral figure, an anonymous blunt instrument wielded by a government department. But to create an illusion of depth, I had to fit Bond out with some theatrical props. And while I kept his wardrobe as discreet as his personality, I did equip him with a distinctive gun, and though they are a security hazard, with distinctive cigarettes. This latter touch of display unfortunately went to my head. I proceeded to invent a cocktail for Bond, which I sampled several months later and found unpalatable. And a rather precious, though basically simple meal ordered by Bond proved so popular with my readers, still suffering from wartime restrictions, that expensive, though I think not ostentatious meals have been eaten in subsequent books. The gimmickry grew like bindweed, and now, while it still amuses me, it has become an unfortunate trademark. I myself abhor wine and foodsmanship. My own favorite food is scrambled eggs. In Live and Let Die, a proofreader pointed out that Bond's addiction to scrambled eggs was becoming a security risk, and I had to go through the book changing menus. And I smoke your own Mancunian brand of Virginia tobacco. However, now that Bond is irretrievably saddled with these vulgar foibles, I can only plead that his Moreland cigarettes are less expensive than the Balkan Sobranis of countless other heroes, that he eats far less and far less well than Nero Wolfe, and that his battered Bentley is no Hirondelle. Perhaps these are superficial excuses. Perhaps Bond's blatant heterosexuality is a subconscious protest against the current fashion for sexual confusion. Perhaps the violence springs from a psychosomatic rejection of welfare wigs, teeth, and spectacles, and Bond's luxury meals are simply saying no to a toad in the hole and telly bickies. Who can say? Who can say whether or not Dr. Fu Manchu was a traumatic image of Sax Roma's father? Who, for the matter of that, cares? Yours, etc., Ian Fleming. Letter 006. In a letter that seems to have been written during the course of 5 consecutive gin and tonics, but was in fact spread over several days, 2 countries, and different bottles, Fleming sent Anne a heartfelt and gossipy message of love, in which he also announced that he had started work on his next book. She declined to come to Goldeneye that year. Ostensibly, the reason was her fear of flying, but in reality, the marriage was beginning to fray. My love, how different my writing looks from the others you get, from Peter, Cornell, and Evelyn, War, and Hugo, Charteris. That is the sort of thing one thinks about after 3 gins and tonics and 3,000 miles of thinking about you. It was horrible leaving the square, I said goodbye 3 times to your room and stole the photograph of you and Caspar. It's now behind a bottle of aquavelva in our bedroom, so as not to be blown down by the wind. Things blown down by the wind worry me. For what it's worth, which at this writing, as they say in America, is not very much to me, Jakey Astor flew with me to America. Vacuum in New York. It's a dead, dreadful place, and I loathe it more and more. The Bryces were very suspicious about your absence. What had happened? Joe Bryce said you were the only woman I had ever loved and ever would. Good? Bad? I said, as I say to everyone, that you are coming later. Nana has changed. It doesn't belong to them anymore. I took some money out. Do you want a fur coat? What shape? What fur? I might get thin to smuggle it. Draw a picture. Give your measurements. Spent the night with the bees. I love Ivar. I can't help it. He needs me. 4 gins and tonics. Second night alone in Grand Central Station Oyster Bar. What do you think I do when I'm abroad? Well, I don't. I sit alone. In fact, I believe you'd rather I didn't. Any person rather than no person. I'm beginning to write like Hugo. It's an obsession. T. Capote was on the heavy anchor. Just arrived from Moscow, suitcase full of caviar for the Paleys, who have built a house beyond Round Hill. V-sweet and nice, loves you, fascinating about Russia. Met the real jet set there who loved him. Found beautiful powder blue Austin on arrival. Drove through dark. Beach miraculous after 4 weeks. Nor the half moon. Very sad without you. Today started book. Got 2 conches, but no fun as you weren't there. And sea crawling with lobsters. Also no fun. Very nice new gardener called Felix. It's a wonderful place, and I can't sell it, but you must be here. It belongs to you, and you're stupid not to come here. You must get rid of your fears of things. Your fears of things are as bad as my fears of people. Brackets, 5th gin and tonic, and good night, my darling love, and come if you possibly can. I love you only in the world. Letter 007 to a teenage fan. To Terry Wing, Esquire, Sentry Hill, Marlow, Buckinghamshire. A teenage pupil had written to settle a bet he had made with a classmate as to whether or not Fleming came from the vicinity of their school. Thank you very much for your letter of June the 15th. And you are right in thinking that Dr. No is the sequel to From Russia with Love. I think you ought to call off the bet with McPhee, as in fact, I used to live at Nettlebed, and my brother Peter lives there, so he was nearly right. Certainly, I do a lot of traveling, as one can't really write truthfully about a place one hasn't seen for oneself. And having been in naval intelligence during the war, I do know something about spies and spying. I am at present driving a Ford Thunderbird, which I have had for 2 years, but I am in the process of changing to a very new model, the Studebaker Avanti, with a top speed of 174 and acceleration from 0 to 60 in 6.5 seconds. So far as your future is concerned, I shouldn't bother to try and emulate James Bond. You are already an adventurous chap with plenty of guts, or you wouldn't be writing to authors out of the blue at the age of 12 and a bit. As a prize for your enterprise, bad English that, I'm sending you an autographed copy of my last but one book, which you don't seem to have read. Best of luck for the future. No more letters.
Thank you so much. Hugh, for those of you who don't know, is a member of the Royal Shakespeare Company. He's appeared in everything from Highlander and Star Wars to Holby City. And in 2002, he became the first black actor to read for 007 in the audiobook of Dr. No.
Yes, not David Oyelowo, by the way.
We're also joined here on the stage at the far end by distinguished critic and crime writer Jessica Mann. Next to her is Professor James Chapman, Director of Film Studies at the University of Leicester and a James Bond expert, a Bondist, a Bondian, I don't know what we call you. But his book, License to Thrill, is an aptly rip-roaring journey through the annals of celluloid Bond. Next to him is Matthew Parker, author of GoldenEye, Where Bond Was Born, a much-praised account of Fleming's time in Jamaica. And on my left is Mr. Andrew Cracknell, who is the owner of the vehicle that some of you may have seen parked outside in the foyer, the DB6. For me, one of the fascinating aspects of those letters was hearing how Fleming had wanted to create an unobtrusive, neutral figure, and yet that creation more than 60 years later, despite seeming sometimes like a bit of a sexist, homophobic, xenophobic dinosaur, dare we say, is still clinging to his cultural relevance. Andrew, you're somebody who has experienced firsthand the fondness for whom in which we hold Bond. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I bought the car in 1987. It was actually quite cheap, and I then used it as my only car, the main car I drove every day until 94 when I went to New York. And in that time, I was never once carved up by anybody else. I never had a key scratch along the side. I had nothing but the most extraordinary, actual positive affection from total strangers every single time I drove it. I found that if you pulled up at traffic, one of those situations where you pull up at traffic lights and pedestrians are threading their way through the cars, they would actually pat it. And motorcycle messengers would sort of swerve in front of you and turn around and leer and stick their thumbs out. I think mainly that was because they were petrol heads, so they just appreciated another piece of engineering. I was twice stopped by the police, and I was actually going a little faster than I should have been. And they just said, do you mind if I have a look, sir? And in fact, on the second occasion, I was actually going faster than I should have been, not excessively, and I was revving quite high, and the policeman stopped me and said, are you aware of the fact you were going too fast? And I said, well, look, yes, I am. I'm really sorry. There's no traffic around, and it's a triple carbureted car. I haven't driven it for some time. It's naturally aspirated. The needles are blocked, and it needs a bit of clearing. And he said, oh, all right then, sir. Do you mind if we have a look? And there was always a sort of positive force field around the car. And very, very, very quickly, the conversation would turn to Bond. And I think it's, as the note on the car says, and as was just said, we ought really to find that car offensive. It's a sort of, it could be argued it's a penis substitute, it's ostentatious, and it represents some of the worst behaviour that men can get up to. And yet, there seems to be an affection for Bond in that car, for Bond, that supersedes all those things. And I think my personal view, and the people on my left are all far more experts than I, is that actually, certainly in the early Bond films, where the DB5 appeared a lot, Bond was actually slightly self-deprecating. Roger Moore went through the whole thing, one eyebrow raised, so you were never expected to take it totally seriously. And then that's why we actually found him charming, and we found it attractive, and therefore his props, in particular, that Aston Martin, gained our affection.
I know Jessica asked the question that probably a lot of people were wondering backstage. Has it got machine guns in the headlights?
Well, I'm not really at liberty to say that. I can't see it. I do know it's very easy, but when somebody gets in it for the first time and sits in the passenger seat, it's quite a good trick just to suddenly say, "Don't touch that!" Whatever you do. But no, it's...
Matthew, am I correct in thinking that originally Bond did not drive that vehicle? Bond on the page drove a different car.
Well, certainly in the first film, in Dr. No, he drives a rather unglamorous convertible. I'm not sure which film, James would know better than me, where that car makes its first appearance.
The Aston Martin first appears in Goldfinger, But Fleming's Bond in the books most of the time drives a Bentley.
Yeah.
Not any Bentley, but actually a 1930s vintage Bentley. So the association with Bond as being rather nostalgic and backward looking. He drives an Aston Martin DB3 in the novel of Goldfinger, but it's made very clear this is just a Secret Service car that he's using for the one assignment. I think one of the crucial things that the films did was to embrace the modernity and go for the new model car. So we have that wonderful moment in the Q workshop scene in Goldfinger where Connery walks in and says, "Where's my Bentley?" And then Q says, "Oh no, that's had its day. You'll be driving this Aston Martin DB5 from now on." And so the film sort of embraced the modern and the new in a way that Fleming's Bond still had that sort of rather slightly old-fashioned British gentleman hero looking back to Bulldog Drummond tradition.
Yeah. Matthew, I think when a lot of us think about Bond, we do inevitably think of the screen incarnation rather than the original page version of the secret agent. I know that your book brilliantly captures the beginning of where Bond originated, and it's set in Jamaica, where Fleming wrote a lot of the original books.
That's right. I mean, it really goes back to a trip that Ian Fleming made during the war in 1943 to Jamaica as part of his role in naval intelligence. There was a 4-day conference, and he went with his friend Ivor Bryce, who was this rather sort of louche ex-Etonian friend. And they had 4 days, and it rained every single day. And Ivor Bryce, who had a house in Jamaica, was terribly disappointed because he wanted Ian to fall in love with Jamaica as he had done. But then, as they were flying out, Ian shut his case and turned to Ivor and said, "When we've won this blasted war, I'm going to come back to Jamaica, I'm going to build a house, and I'm going to write books, and that's going to be my life." And he did. He came back in 46, he built a house called Golden on the north coast, and it really, for the first decade or so, it was this just amazing sort of bachelor pad, and he entertained the most beautiful women of his generation. He went to these incredible parties that were going on the north coast, which was the most fashionable place for film stars and for aristocrats and millionaires. He spent hours on the reef, all elements, of course, that come up in the Bond novels. And then in 1952, he had a sort of crisis. Now, Hughes, in the letter, has talked about the marriage in 52, which is when he found that his girlfriend, Anne, was pregnant, and he decided against the advice of all his friends to do the right thing and marry her. It was also a crisis, of course, for the Secret Service. It was the debacle of the Cambridge spies had just been uncovered. And Fleming was horrified as well about how his beloved empire and his beloved Britain's power was seeping away. And the reaction to this crisis was to create this James Bond figure, totally reliant, a real sort of Tory, totally different to what he saw as the feather-bedded welfare state of the post-war Britain. And it was, I think, also, probably more than anything, he needed money to pay for the child and to pay for his house. And then, of course, he said to Anne, his wife, "Can I dedicate this book to you?" And she said, "Oh, I don't think so. It's not the sort of book that one once dedicated." And in fact, he had terrible forebodings about his marriage, all of which turned out to be sadly correct.
What are the crucial aspects of his character that are still with him in his, Daniel Craig iteration?
A Bond or Fleming?
Yeah, of Bond.
I think he's a very dispassionate. He's very cold. He's sort of emotionally sort of fairly crippled, I think you could say. And everything really about Bond leads back to Fleming. There was something which I read recently, I think it was in The Observer, about boarding school syndrome. And this was the sort of the psychological damage done to young boys who go away to boarding school at 8. And they had this sort of they had this list of the symptoms, and it was things like inability to form lasting relationships, tendency to anger, and substance abuse. And you can look at Fleming and just go tick, 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 tick all the way down. And I think that sort of really sort of depression and the complicated sort of dual nature of his personality, he poured all of that into Bond.
How important do you think that coldness is to his popularity? Bizarre. I mean, do you think there's an extent to which even on screen, he's holding the viewer at a slight distance, which is just a colossal tease that makes us want
I think that's part of his charisma, and it's certainly part of Fleming's charisma. I mean, Anne, when she first met him before the war, said, "Oh, he's the most beautiful man I've ever seen," but somehow untouchable and aloof and disconnected from sort of normal people. He had this sort of apartness and melancholy, which some women found very attractive.
In the film versions, there is a lot, eight different actors, and yet, as franchises go, nothing comes close to it. I think Spectre's the 24th official Bond movie. Do you think, I mean, we've just talked about the aspects of his character that are constant, even in transition from page to screen. Do you think his success is more to the malleability of his character, or he can exist in whatever time the film is made? He moves around. He's international. He's not pinned in the way that, Bourne is pinned. He's locked into that battle with the CIA. Do you think that success is down more to his malleability or the constants?
I think with any kind of explanation of a cultural phenomenon like James Bond, it is quite complex. The first point I made is that whatever our views over the respective merits of the Bond movies as movies, the film series is a quite remarkable production achievement. 53 years now, and if we say from round about the 19-teens was the period when we saw the film industry emerge as a major business enterprise, then the Bond movies have been around for pretty much half the history of cinema. And there's really nothing to match them on that level, regardless of whether the films are any good. I think there's always a contradiction in explaining the popularity of James Bond. On the one hand, Bond in Fleming's version is formed within the sort of social, cultural, ideological context of 1950s Britain. So Fleming is writing in the aftermath of the Second World War. He's writing at the period of the gradual shift from a culture of austerity to a culture of affluence. He's writing just on the cusp of the Cultural Revolution and changes in sort of sexual behaviour and mores and morals and so on. So when you read Fleming's novels now, they're very much products of the 1950s. That said, James Bond remains modern and contemporary and a hero for our own times, largely due, not entirely, but I think largely due to the way in which the films have changed to some extent, modified the Bond character. James Bond always has to be James Bond. There always has to be some link back to Fleming in the films to make it Ian Fleming's James Bond, as the title sequences always tell us. But what we've seen, I think, is the films have constantly modified, updated the formula. The archetype of masculinity that Bond represents has changed in response to shifting social and cultural values. So Sean Connery in the 1960s is very much in that kind of Albert Finney, Tom Courtenay, Peter O'Toole generation of British actors on the kind of cusp of stardom. By the 1970s, when we get the Roger Moore James Bond, that's very much more of a retreat to a kind of high Englishness and slightly parodic. In the 1980s, or the late 1980s, we got the Timothy Dalton James Bond, which becomes a more serious and more sober, closer to Ian Fleming's character, although the plots had moved on by that stage. So all the actors, I think, bring something different to the role, and we can debate as to whether Connery is better than Daniel Craig or whether Roger Moore really deserves to be taken seriously as a proper James Bond. But all the actors, I think, have brought something to the part that's right for the times in which the films were made.
Jessica, could you talk a little bit about where James Bond fits into the pantheon of ultimate masculine heroes?
Well, you have to remember when he first appeared. The first book was published in 1953. It was an incredibly Puritan society. This book, in which he slept with somebody he wasn't married to, he committed crimes, he had guns, it was pure fantasy. And then when it came on the screen, it really didn't match the book particularly well. So he was writing between 1953 and I think the end of the 60s, by which time the world had changed to join him a bit. But it's really quite important to remember how very iconoclastic the book seemed when they came out. That they were coming into a society which just didn't do those things. Or if they did, they didn't talk about them. Would you agree?
I think to an extent I would agree. I might also disagree. The Bond novels, just as Bond films, are fantasies. They're fantasies of masculinity, they're fantasies of Britishness, they're fantasies of male success and so on. But I think they're also rooted in a certain certain cultural environment where we start to see, by the 1950s, certainly by the 1960s, certain changes in society that Fleming's character is really on the cusp
yes,
of
by the 60s,
representing.
I agree. Now, in 1963, 63 was the dividing year. It was the year when the pill came out, and that changed society enormously. But the 1950s looked backwards, not forwards. Believe me, I remember them. It really wasn't like James Bond at all. The books were a fantasy.
Well, I would say again yes and no. To read Casino Royale today, the first of the Ian Fleming books, this is not the James Bond of megalomaniac supervillains bent on world domination and so on. It's a relatively low-key story. It's set very explicitly against the background of the Cold War, which was very real and current at the time. And it also, I mean, this is something the recent films have taken up, but Casino Royale, in the very first Bond novel, Bond doesn't get the girl at the end. She turns out to be a traitor. She turns out to be a double agent. Well, this was being published in 1953. It was written in 1952. It's immediately after the Burgess and Maclean defections. I think Fleming, in the first novel, is trying to reflect something of the sort of political reality of the times. Now, he does that in that book, and then so the later books, Goldfinger, Dr. No, Thunderball, of course, we move into the more sensational realm of the adventure thriller in a kind of Richard Hannay, Bulldog Drummond tradition. But go back and read Casino Royale, I would say, which, the first of the Bond novels, it's rather different from what comes later.
Well, I would agree with you that the patriotism in it is a particular point, and presumably on purpose to contradict Burgess and Maclean.
There's a strong emphasis on the Empire, there's a strong emphasis on Bond as a patriot. As late as You Only Live Twice, where Bond is going to pieces because of the murder of his wife at the end of the previous novel, and M gives him a task on the advice of the Secret Service neurologist, which says he's a pretty patriotic sort of chap, just give him something that calls upon all his courage and all his devotion and all his resourcefulness. Fleming is writing in the period, and Matthew made this point as well, Fleming is writing in the period where we start to see, 1953 is the year of the coronation, Elizabeth II. It's a sort of retrospective affirmation, celebration of British imperial grandeur. It was the last, almost certainly the last imperial coronation. But Fleming is writing during the period of the Suez Crisis, of the retreat from empire, and of the decline of British power on the world stage. And that's mediated in the novels. The novels acknowledge that, but they also seem to regret and lament that decline of British power and prestige.
Matthew, I think you'd said somewhere that Bond is an imperial hero.
Well, there's something that, going back to what James was saying, there's some, Casino Royale is very different to the other books. In it, Bond, I think, at one point says, all this my country right or wrong business is a bit out of date.
Yeah.
And he never says anything like that in any of the other. He becomes much more solidly patriotic. And this is part of his sort of interesting sort of dual nature, that he is at one time rather old-fashioned in that he has total loyalty to M and to his country and to the mission.
But an old-fashioned kind of masculinity as well. It's very unapologetic, very sure of itself.
That's right. But at the same time as being, a sort of traditional patriotic hero, he is, of course, also, incredibly indulgent and, obsessed with sort of brands and very modern in that sense as well. But one of the strengths of the book, and one of the things that makes Bond stand out, is that he is almost the lone hero. As James said, Fleming fills the books with the lament and regret about how the Secret Service is underfunded, the Americans have got much more money, all we have is the sort of the lone hero with the public school spirit. And this really elevates Bond into this sort of superhero status.
I wonder if there's an extent to which Bond won't be able to evolve anymore. And I note that you said a few weeks ago in an interview that no self-respecting black actor should really want to play Bond.
Well, no, that's not quite what I said.
No. Journalists twisting your words.
I did question whether any of us would. It is, and I did actually go on to say, yes, I think we should, because it is very much a cultural icon, and it would be as well if we appropriated it and just laid claim to it. But it is problematic, because Bond isn't just a hero, he's a brand. You heard in the letters that Fleming had become a little bit embarrassed by the signifiers of Bond, that he'd invented this vodka martini shaken not stirred for added specificity, as if and this is the drink that only, I imagine, retired stockbrokers from Surrey would drink on a cruise ship. But if a black actor were going to play Bond, would he be drinking vodka martini shaken not stirred? I seriously doubt it. Idris Elba, I don't know him that well, but I'm guessing he might go for a vodka and Red Bull or a Jaeger bomb. But if a black actor was seen, black Bond was seen driving the latest Aston Martin, the DB10 Inspector, you can be sure he'd be stopped every hour by a policeman. He'd probably have to switch to a Vauxhall or a van or something in order to keep his secret identity secret. But there are certain. Whoever is cast as Bond has to be able to sell Aston Martins, Omega watches, cologne, Tom Ford suits, and various brands of sunglasses. So they, if they thought a black actor could do that, then they'll cast it. But Bond isn't any longer the hero, the imperial hero, following on in that great tradition of Alan Quatermain and Hannay and Bulldog Drummond. He's now become very much an advertising agent's dream. Really.
You have to accept there's the most enormous difference between the books and the movies. They hardly connect.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
The difference between the books and the films.
Oh, absolutely.
Is so enormous. They
yes,
hardly connect.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I remarked earlier that I read Dr. No as an audiobook, and I understood it had been written before independence. I understand now that the film was completed shortly before Jamaica became independent. But so it still harked back to those pre-independence values, but the attitudes that in the film were clearly, to my mind anyway, slightly ambivalent. Sean Connery was really rather harsh towards Quarrel in the movie, whereas in the film, Bond is rather more, if not paternal, at least he's rather fraternal. He and Quarrel go back in a way, and it's a rather sweet relationship. But you're quite right. I think the movies mark a kind of break with that literary tradition, and in a way that the Rider Haggard novels or the Bucker novels couldn't, because Fleming was writing at the time of the Cold War, and so it was a very modern phenomenon.
Jessica.
Yes, I just wanted to say something about the Bond books that are not written by Ian Fleming. We haven't talked about those at all, but quite a few writers wrote sequels to James Bond, and they were much more political and much fuller of product placement. There was one very bourgeois one in which Bond was driving a quite small car and behaving like a normal suburban gentleman. I can see why the books didn't succeed, but there were quite a lot of them.
Yeah, and they're still coming, indeed, aren't they? I don't know if you want to give us one final thought as the Aston Martin driver.
I was wondering whether or not, particularly with the suits, whether they do actually influence anybody, because it's now so obvious what's going on that you could argue that anybody who turns up wearing something that Bond's worn is actually asking for trouble. He said driving an Aston Martin. But I just actually, well, I mean, maybe you know. I mean, does the fashion business, you can understand the product placement in terms of overall brands, but is there a sort of spike in sales for various things that have been in Bond films following the release of a Bond film? I don't know. Does it work?
I think we're out of time, is my answer to that. And I gather Jude Kelly is going to step up and wrap us up.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you to the great panel of experts to unpacking this particular conundrum about why James Bond can't die. So I'd like to thank you for that. So thank you to everybody, including this panel, who've helped us think about the ongoing debate about what is masculinity, and even the things that we know we may not wish masculinity to fully be. Are we still nostalgically hanging on to them? Do we want them still to be there because they sort of satisfy something that we've always been told finally is a proper man? Or is that proper man thing something which is really stopping boys evolving into individual men? It's an ongoing debate. But you've been with us for some or all of this weekend, and thank you very much to everybody who's been here. Thank you.